For many people, the idea that someone could excel in both are traditionally associated with the so-called right brain, and science, often linked to the left brain, seems almost contradictory. Even impossible. We've been told for decades that the hemispheres divide us neatly, the right reserved for dreamers, artists, and visionaries, while the left governs scientists, mathematicians, and rational thinkers. But is there any truth to this story of dominant hemispheres? Does being left-brained really make someone less imaginative, more rigid, more logical? And conversely, does leaning on the right brain unlock hidden stores of creativity at first glance? The theory feels seductive. It offers a tidy explanation for why some of us paint and others calculate, why one person writes poetry while another codes software. But the truth, revealed through decades of neuroscience, is far more fascinating and far less divided. The brain does show lateralization. Some functions are indeed more prominent in one hemisphere than the other, but this is not the same as having a single dominant brain. Instead of working in isolation, the hemispheres are in constant dialogue, exchanging signals so rapidly that, in a healthy brain, you rarely notice the divide at all. Creativity and logic are not housed on opposite sides like warring nations. They are emergent properties of collaboration, rising from networks that span the hemispheres. Science demands imagination, just as art demands structure and technique. And some of the greatest achievements of human history, from Da Vinci's inventions to Einstein's theories, were born precisely at the intersection of these supposedly separate realms. So, does tapping into your right hemisphere make you more creative? Not quite. What makes you creative is not silencing one side of the brain, but allowing both to work together, integrating precision with imagination, order with wonder, structure with possibility. Right versus left. Few ideas about the brain have spread as widely or been misinterpreted as deeply as the belief that the left hemisphere is logical and analytical, while the right hemisphere is creative and artistic. For decades, this neat division has been repeated in classrooms, pop psychology books, and even corporate training sessions. It paints a compelling picture: two halves of the brain locked in a quiet battle, one favoring reason, the other imagination. According to this story, the hemispheres don't cooperate, they compete. The left brain, we are told, is the rigid overseer, obsessed with rules and order. The right brain, in contrast, is the free spirit, brimming with color, intuition, and originality. And so, the myth suggests, if only we could silence or shut down the overbearing left hemisphere, we would finally unleash the untapped genius of the right. It is a seductive idea because it seems to explain so much: why some of us become scientists while others become artists, why one person thrives in spreadsheets while another thrives on a stage. It gives us categories, labels, and a sense of identity. But neuroscience tells a far richer story. The hemispheres are not rival siblings fighting for control. They are partners in constant dialogue, joined by millions of neural fibers that allow information to flow seamlessly back and forth. Far from stifling creativity, the so-called logical left hemisphere is deeply involved in it, just as the creative right hemisphere is involved in analysis and reasoning. The truth is that art and science, logic and imagination, are never confined to one side of the brain. They emerge from collaboration, from networks that span both hemispheres, weaving detail and pattern, rule and inspiration, into a unified whole. The complexity of brain lesions. There is indeed compelling evidence that when damage occurs in one hemisphere of the brain, patients can show very different symptoms than those whose injuries affect the opposite side. For example, damage to the left hemisphere might impair speech and language, while comparable damage on the right might disrupt spatial awareness or emotional recognition. This demonstrates that the brain is, to some extent, modular. Different regions, and sometimes entire hemispheres, take on specialized roles, but this is only part of the story. The truth is far more complex than a simple one-to-one mapping of function to location. While certain abilities like language, motor control, or visual processing are more lateralized to one hemisphere, almost all higher functions emerge from networks that span across both sides. The brain is not a series of isolated silos but a dynamic, constantly communicating system. Even within patients who share similar lesions, the outcomes can vary dramatically. Two individuals with damage in the same region may show completely different symptom profiles, depending on their age, brain plasticity, prior experiences, and even genetic predispositions. This variability underscores an important truth. The brain's organization is not fixed like a machine. It is adaptive, redundant, and capable of rerouting functions in extraordinary ways. Thus, while lesion studies gave us the first glimpse into the concept of functional specialization, they also highlight the dangers of oversimplification. The hemispheres and their regions may have their specialties, but the richness of thought, creativity, and reason emerges only when the entire brain is in dialogue with itself. By studying groups of patients with lesions in specific areas of the brain, neuroscientists began to uncover a remarkable pattern. Some cognitive functions were not spread evenly across both hemispheres, but were localized primarily to one side. This was one of the earliest clues that the brain is not a perfect mirror image of itself, but instead shows functional asymmetry. The most famous example of this is language. For most people, speech production and comprehension are concentrated in the left hemisphere, particularly in specialized areas such as Broca's area involved in speech production and Wernicke's area involved in understanding language. Patients with damage to these regions often experience profound disruptions in communication, providing compelling evidence that certain abilities are lateralized. This principle, the assignment of specific functions to one hemisphere or the other, is known as lateralization. But lateralization is not absolute. Even in the case of language, where the left hemisphere dominates, the right hemisphere still contributes, especially in processing tone, rhythm, and emotional nuances of speech. Lesion studies laid the groundwork for this discovery, but later tools like neuroimaging confirmed and refined it, showing that lateralization is not about rigid separation but about dominant tendencies. In other words, one hemisphere may take the lead in certain processes, but the other still plays an important supporting role. Understanding lateralization reshaped how scientists think about the brain, not as two identical halves doing the same work, but as specialized partners, each with unique strengths that together create the full richness of human thought and behavior. Hemispheres and the senses. When it comes to our senses and actions, the hemispheres don't process information identically. Instead, they operate in a cross-wired arrangement, where each side of the brain is primarily responsible for the opposite side of the body and the surrounding space. The right hemisphere processes sensory information and motor control for the left side of the body, while the left hemisphere does the same for the right side. This crisscrossing organization is especially clear in vision. What you see in your left visual field, that is, everything to the left of where your eyes are focused, is represented primarily in the right hemisphere. Conversely, what falls in your right visual field is processed mainly by the left hemisphere. This crossing over, called contralateral representation, explains why damage to one hemisphere can impair movement, sensation, or perception on the opposite side of the body. For example, a stroke in the right hemisphere often results in weakness or paralysis on the left side, while damage to the left hemisphere might affect the ability to move or sense the right side. Yet this isn't just about motor control or vision. The hemispheres also differ subtly in how they process the world. The right hemisphere tends to handle more holistic, spatial, and contextual information, allowing us to navigate environments, recognize faces, and sense patterns in space. The left hemisphere, meanwhile, leans toward detail-oriented and sequential processing, giving us fine motor control, precision in movement, and structured approaches to problem solving. So while the brain's wiring ensures that the two hemispheres divide sensory and motor tasks across the body, they are not working in isolation. Instead, they are constantly sharing information, integrating detail and context, left and right, into a seamless experience of the world. Your brain is wired in a fascinatingly cross-connected way. The left hemisphere controls movement on the right side of your body, which is why your right hand is guided by your left brain. Similarly, everything you see in your left visual field is projected to the right side of your visual cortex, and vice versa. From this arrangement, a popular assumption emerged: if you deliberately engage the left side of your body, you are somehow activating your right hemisphere, and since the right hemisphere is supposed to be the creative one, you'll unlock more imagination and artistry. It's an appealing idea, but it glosses over several flawed assumptions, most of which don't hold up under scientific scrutiny. First, while the hemispheres do process information from opposite sides of the body, this doesn't mean they work in isolation. The two halves of your brain are in constant communication, with signals traveling across the corpus callosum so rapidly that in a healthy brain, neither hemisphere ever truly works alone. Second, creativity itself is not a simple product of right brain activity. Studies of artists, musicians, and writers show that creative tasks light up networks across both hemispheres. The right hemisphere may help with holistic perception, patterns, and spatial awareness, but the left hemisphere contributes language, structure, and sequencing, both of which are essential for art, science, and innovation alike. Finally, the assumption ignores the brain's plasticity. Functions are not rigidly locked to one side forever. They can be shared, compensated, or even reorganized, especially in younger brains or in response to injury. This flexibility shows us that creativity and logic are not about flipping a switch to access one hemisphere, but about how well the entire brain collaborates. So while it's true that your right hand is steered by your left brain and your left visual field is processed by your right brain, the leap to tap into your right hemisphere to be more creative is a mythical shortcut. The truth is far richer. Creativity is not a one-sided gift, it's a whole brain achievement. Dominant hands, dominant hemispheres. Just as most people naturally develop a dominant hand, it's very likely that each of us also has a dominant hemisphere. In fact, the two are related. It's because of hemispheric dominance that handedness develops in the first place. The hemisphere that takes the lead in managing fine motor skills tends to determine which hand you favor, but the relationship is not as straightforward as it sounds. Neuroscientists are still unraveling the details of how lateralization of cognition, the way certain mental abilities tend to favor one hemisphere and handedness, are linked. The deeper they look, the more complicated the story becomes. Handedness is shaped by a mixture of genetics, brain development, and environment. And while most right-handed people do show left hemisphere dominance for language and other functions, exceptions abound. Left-handers, in particular, display a much wider variety of brain organization. Some still have left hemisphere dominance, others rely more on the right, and a significant proportion distribute functions across both hemispheres more evenly. What this means is that dominance doesn't imply a rigid split, nor does it make one hemisphere better than the other. It simply means that certain abilities tend to lean more heavily on one side, but the brain is highly interconnected, and even so-called dominant hemispheres rely on cooperation with their partners to carry out complex thought and action. In short, the story of hemispheric dominance and handedness is still being written, and with every new study, it reveals just how wonderfully nuanced, flexible, and adaptive our brains really are. For most right-handed people, the story is fairly consistent. The left hemisphere is dominant, especially for language functions like speech, grammar, and comprehension. This is why strokes or injuries on the left side of the brain often result in difficulties with language, a condition known as aphasia. But the picture changes when we look at left-handed individuals. Here, the patterns of lateralization become more diverse. Roughly 20% of left-handers show right hemisphere dominance for language. Another 20% display bilateral language representation, meaning that both hemispheres share the work of processing language more evenly. The remaining 50 to 60% of left-handers still rely primarily on the left hemisphere for language, just like right-handers. This variability shows that lateralization is not absolute and that handedness doesn't automatically predict how the brain organizes itself. Left-handedness does increase the likelihood of atypical language distribution, but even here, the majority still follow the standard left-dominant pattern. What this tells us is that the human brain is remarkably flexible. The neat division we often imagine righties with left brain language, lefties with right brain language just isn't accurate. Instead, brains develop with a range of possibilities, influenced by genetics, early development, environment, and even chance, and perhaps, most importantly, this diversity doesn't come with disadvantage. People with different patterns of lateralization communicate, think, and create just as effectively. The variation is simply another reminder that the brain resists simple labels like right-brained. Our left-brained, even though many core language functions such as grammar, syntax, and word recognition are concentrated in the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is far from silent in communication. It plays an equally vital, though often overlooked, role in shaping how we understand and express meaning. The right hemisphere specializes in prosody, the melody of speech. It deciphers intonation, rhythm, and accentuation, helping us hear the difference between a genuine question and a sarcastic remark, or recognize when a statement is meant as a joke rather than a command. Without this contribution, speech would sound flat and robotic, stripped of nuance. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere operates as the brain's grammar police and dictionary. It enforces linguistic rules, ensures sentences are structured correctly, and pulls precise words from memory. This allows us to convey meaning with accuracy and complexity. Together, these hemispheric contributions show that language is not simply a left brain function. Instead, it is a whole brain collaboration. The left provides structure and vocabulary, while the right colors communication with emotion, emphasis, and tone. It's the difference between reading a script and performing it, between words on a page and words that move another human being. From lesions to neuroimaging, before the era of modern brain scanning, the best window into hemispheric specialization came from studying people with lateralized brain lesions or those who had undergone commissurotomies. These rare cases provided neuroscientists with natural experiments. If damage to one side of the brain produced a specific deficit, it offered clues about which functions that hemisphere controlled. But lesion studies and split brain patients could only take us so far. They were limited to what could be inferred from injury or surgical intervention, and they couldn't show the brain in action in real time. The revolution came with the explosion of neuroimaging research in the late 20th century. Techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI) and positron emission tomography (PET) made it possible to watch healthy brains at work, moment by moment, while people solved problems, listened to music, spoke, or daydreamed. For the first time, scientists could track activity dynamically across both hemispheres, revealing a far more complex and nuanced picture of lateralization. Instead of rigid left brain and right brain categories, imaging showed networks that spanned hemispheres, engaging depending on the task at hand. Some functions were more strongly lateralized, like language, which leaned left, but Others involve distributed cooperation, with both hemispheres lighting up in synchrony. This shift from studying the damage to studying the living marked a profound leap in our understanding of the brain. It allowed us to see not just what happens when the system breaks, but how the hemispheres communicate, complement, and collaborate when everything is working as it should. Neuroimaging has revealed that the hemispheres don't just divide labor in language or motor control, they also seem to process emotions differently. The evidence suggests a subtle but fascinating asymmetry. The left hemisphere often shows greater activation during experiences of positive emotions such as joy, hope, or excitement. The right hemisphere, by contrast, tends to show stronger activity when we process negative emotions such as fear, sadness, or anger. This pattern, sometimes called the valence hypothesis, doesn't mean that one hemisphere owns happiness and the other owns sorrow. Both hemispheres are always active during emotional experiences. Instead, it suggests a bias or emphasis. The left hemisphere leans slightly toward approach-related emotions, those that drive us to engage with the world, while the right hemisphere leans toward withdrawal-related emotions, those that prepare us to pull back or protect ourselves. This asymmetry may explain why damage to one hemisphere can influence emotional style. For instance, patients with damage to the left hemisphere sometimes experience symptoms of depression, while damage to the right hemisphere can lead to exaggerated cheerfulness or a lack of awareness of problems. What's important is that these differences do not map onto the oversimplified cultural story of right brain equals creative, left brain equals logical. Instead, they highlight the fine-tuned division of labor between hemispheres, each adding its strengths to the emotional spectrum. The full richness of human feeling comes not from one side working alone, but from their interplay, the balancing act of optimism and caution, engagement and withdrawal, that helps us survive and thrive. One of the most intriguing insights from neuroimaging research is not just what each hemisphere does, but how each one is wired internally. If you could draw a wiring diagram of the brain's white matter tracks, the bundles of fibers that connect different regions, you'd see that the hemispheres don't look the same on the inside. The right hemisphere has been described as more efficiently connected. Its white matter tracks link regions broadly and densely, allowing information to travel quickly between distant areas. This kind of wiring is particularly well suited for integrative processes, things like visuospatial reasoning, holistic perception, and the ability to bring together patterns from different sources at once. By contrast, the left hemisphere appears to be more modular. Its white matter tracks are arranged in a way that allows certain regions to operate with a greater degree of independence. This setup favors specialization. It explains why we often find very specific abilities like grammar, fine motor control, or precise sequential processing lateralized to the left hemisphere. This difference in wiring is important because it helps explain why the two hemispheres have different cognitive styles without falling into the trap of oversimplified stereotypes. The right hemisphere's broad connectivity makes it excellent at integration and big-picture processing, while the left hemisphere's modular structure makes it effective at detail, rules, and focused analysis. But, as always, the key is cooperation. Neither style is inherently superior, and both are constantly in use. Creativity, logic, memory, and problem-solving are whole brain phenomena, rising from the interplay of the right hemisphere's efficiency and the left hemisphere's specialization. Specialization versus integration. These wiring differences offer a powerful clue as to why the hemispheres function the way they do. The left hemisphere, with its more modular wiring, seems to house regions that operate with greater independence, each one finely tuned to handle a specific task. This modularity is why we often find tightly specialized abilities such as syntax, arithmetic, or fine motor control localized to the left side. Each region can focus on its narrow job without depending too heavily on others. The right hemisphere, however, tells a different story. Its wiring encourages integration. Regions are linked more broadly, meaning information is shared across wider networks. This makes the right hemisphere especially well-suited for visuospatial processing, holistic perception, and pattern recognition. It's what allows us to see the forest as well as the trees, to recognize a face not just as a collection of features, but as a whole. This division of labor doesn't mean that one hemisphere is inherently logical and the other creative. Instead, it shows us that the left hemisphere excels at specialization, while the right hemisphere excels at synthesis. Both approaches are essential. Science needs creativity, art needs structure, and the human brain thrives not because one hemisphere dominates, but because the two are in constant partnership, specialization feeding into integration, and integration enriching specialization. It's undeniably easier to find specialization in the left hemisphere than in the right. The left side contains well-defined regions that light up predictably during tasks such as language, symbolic reasoning, and sequential analysis. Neuroscientists can map these areas with relative precision, which makes the left hemisphere appear more straightforward in its organization. The right hemisphere, in contrast, is harder to pin down. Its wiring emphasizes integration over isolation, broad networks pulling together visual, spatial, and contextual information, because its functions are distributed and less modular. They are harder to localize with the same clarity we find in the left. This difference has often been misinterpreted. People searching for a simple story saw the left hemisphere's clear specialization and labeled it the logical side. They saw the right hemisphere's more integrative wiring and linked it to creativity and holistic thinking. Out of this exaggeration grew the now famous myth of the left-brained, rational person versus the right-brained, creative one. But the reality is far more fascinating. The hemispheres are not competing specialists, they are collaborative partners. Creativity does not belong solely to the right any more than logic belongs solely to the left. Instead, every act of creation or reasoning depends on both styles working together, the left's focus and precision woven with the right's breadth and context. The myth persists because it is simple and intuitive, but the truth is richer. The brain's power lies not in its division, but in its ability to integrate specialization and synthesis into a single, seamless mind. One of the clearest insights from modern neuroimaging research is just how relentlessly the two hemispheres of the brain communicate with one another. Unless the bridge between them, the corpus callosum, is surgically severed, signals are constantly zipping back and forth, weaving the activity of both sides into a unified experience. This crosstalk happens during nearly every task we perform. Whether we're solving a math equation, reading a poem, playing music, or navigating a busy street, information flows across hemispheres with astonishing speed. In fact, for many tasks, the brain's efficiency depends not on which hemisphere is dominant, but on how quickly and seamlessly the two halves can share information. This finding undercuts the popular myth of the brain as a divided system of rivals. Instead, it shows the brain as a collaborative network, one in which the hemispheres act less like competitors and more like partners in dialogue. Each side contributes its strength, specialization on the left, integration on the right, but it's their constant communication that allows thought, creativity, and decision-making to emerge as a whole. Another surprising finding from neuroimaging and electrophysiology research is that in many regions, signals pass from one hemisphere to the other more quickly than they do within a single hemisphere. In other words, the brain's two halves don't just communicate, they sometimes do so with greater speed and efficiency than areas on the same side. For example, studies of the prefrontal cortex, the brain's command center for planning, reasoning, and decision-making show that signals exchanged between the left and right prefrontal regions can actually travel faster than signals sent from the back of the brain to the front within the same hemisphere. This means the corpus callosum, often imagined as just a bridge or cable, is not simply a backup route but a superhighway of information flow. Rather than slowing thought down, cross-hemispheric transfer can enhance coordination, ensuring that decisions, perceptions, and actions are built from the best of both hemispheres in real time. This discovery further undermines the old idea that the hemispheres are separate or competing. The truth is the opposite. The brain has evolved to ensure that integration across hemispheres is often faster and more efficient than isolated, one-sided processing. Creativity, problem-solving, and even everyday perception depend on this rapid dialogue. Studying patients with seizures. To truly understand where the left brain, right brain myth came from and why the reality is so much more fascinating, we need to step back to a time before modern neuroimaging. Back then, neuroscientists and psychologists relied heavily on patients with unusual conditions to uncover how the brain worked. One of the most important groups they studied were patients with epilepsy. Epileptic seizures happen when there is a sudden burst of abnormal electrical activity in the brain. Normally, electrical impulses travel in orderly patterns along neural pathways, carrying signals from one region to another. But during a seizure, these signals spiral out of control. What begins as a small disturbance in one part of the brain can quickly spread across neural circuits, igniting both hemispheres. When the abnormal activity spreads far and wide, the result can be severe, full-brain seizures, episodes that are not only disruptive but dangerous, sometimes leaving patients incapacitated or even threatening their lives. By the mid-20th century, epilepsy was one of the most debilitating neurological disorders, and treatments were limited. In the 1940s, two neurosurgeons attempted something bold: an experimental surgery designed to prevent seizures from spreading. Their reasoning was straightforward. If the abnormal electrical storm could be contained to just one hemisphere, then seizures might be less catastrophic. Their plan was to sever the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that acts as the brain's information superhighway, connecting the left and right hemispheres. The logic was radical but simple. If the hemispheres couldn't talk to each other, then perhaps the seizure activity would remain trapped in one side of the brain instead of overwhelming both, although their first attempts did not bring the relief they hoped for. This line of thinking would later inspire some of the most groundbreaking and myth-producing experiments in neuroscience. These early surgeries were the first step toward a deeper exploration of what happens when the brain's hemispheres are cut off from one another, a discovery that would ultimately shape both science and popular culture. In the 1940s, neurosurgeons, facing the devastating effects of severe epilepsy, began to think in radical terms. They noticed that seizures often started in one region of the brain but then spread like wildfire across neural pathways, overwhelming both hemispheres and leading to full-blown convulsions. Their reasoning was deceptively simple. What if the abnormal electrical activity could be trapped on one side of the brain? If it couldn't jump across to the other hemisphere, maybe the seizures would remain more localized and therefore less severe and less life-threatening. To test this, they proposed a surgical procedure unlike anything attempted before: severing the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers that acts as the brain's main communication highway. The corpus callosum contains hundreds of millions of connections, allowing the left and right hemispheres to share information almost instantaneously. By cutting this tract, surgeons believed they could stop the electrical storm from crossing hemispheres, effectively quarantining it to just one side. It was a daring idea, born out of desperation to help patients who had no other options. And although these first surgeries were crude and largely unsuccessful, They planted the seed for one of the most important chapters in neuroscience, the exploration of what happens when the two halves of the brain are cut off from each other. And fortunately, those first attempts in the 1940s to control seizures by severing the corpus callosum were disappointing. The initial patients saw little to no improvement, and in some cases, their condition did not change at all. Because the surgeries failed to deliver results, the approach was quickly abandoned for a time. But the underlying idea that seizures could be controlled by preventing abnormal electrical activity from spreading between hemispheres wasn't wrong. It was simply incomplete. By the early 1960s, a new generation of neurosurgeons revisited the concept. With better knowledge of brain anatomy and more refined surgical tools, they realized that the problem with the earlier operations wasn't the theory, it was the technique. The 1940s procedures had only severed the corpus callosum, the largest bundle of connecting fibers, but there were other, smaller pathways still intact, such as the hippocampal commissure and the anterior commissure, which also allowed abnormal signals to leap from one hemisphere to the other. These overlooked connections undermine the surgery's effectiveness. Armed with this insight, surgeons in the 1960s began performing more comprehensive procedures, cutting not only the corpus callosum but these additional commissures as well. The result was far more promising. These commissurectomies successfully reduced the severity and frequency of seizures in patients who had been suffering debilitating episodes for years. What had once looked like a failed experiment was suddenly transformed into a breakthrough treatment. And more importantly, it opened the door to one of the most fascinating chapters in neuroscience, the study of what happens when the brain's hemispheres are cut off from one another. In those early surgeries of the 1940s, neurosurgeons focused only on cutting the corpus callosum, the largest bundle of nerve fibers connecting the two hemispheres. It seemed logical. This massive tract containing hundreds of millions of axons was the brain's main communication highway. If seizures spread by traveling across hemispheres, severing the callosum should have stopped them. But the brain is rarely that simple. The hemispheres are not connected by one bridge alone, but by multiple pathways. In addition to the corpus callosum, there are two other commissures, the hippocampal commissure and the anterior commissure. The hippocampal commissure links the left and right hippocampi, regions critical for memory and spatial navigation. The anterior commissure is a smaller but significant tract that connects parts of the temporal lobes, allowing signals to cross between hemispheres even without the corpus callosum. Because these secondary routes were left intact in the first operations, abnormal electrical activity still had ways to leap across hemispheres. The seizures weren't contained, and the surgeries failed. It wasn't until the 1960s, when neurosurgeons realized the importance of cutting all three commissures, that the procedure began to succeed. By severing the corpus callosum, hippocampal commissure, and anterior commissure, they could finally isolate each hemisphere, trapping seizures on one side instead of allowing them to engulf the whole brain. These refined operations, known as commissurectomies, not only improved patients' lives but also opened the door to groundbreaking studies of what happens when the brain's hemispheres can no longer communicate. Commissurectomies, a new approach, armed with the insight that seizures could still jump across hemispheres through pathways beyond the corpus callosum. Neurosurgeons in the 1960s refined their surgical strategy. Instead of stopping with the callosum, they began cutting the additional commissures, the hippocampal and anterior commissures, along with it. These more comprehensive operations became known as commissurectomies. Unlike the early, flawed surgeries of the 1940s, commissurectomies were far more effective. By fully severing all major routes of communication between the left and right hemispheres, they managed to trap abnormal electrical activity on the side where it originated. This prevented seizures from cascading across the brain, dramatically reducing their spread and severity in patients who had previously suffered from constant life-disrupting episodes. The success of these procedures was remarkable. For many patients with otherwise uncontrollable epilepsy, commissurotomies offered not just relief but a new lease on life. The surgeries marked a turning point in neurosurgery and provided scientists with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to study what happens when the two halves of the brain are forced to function independently. What began as a desperate treatment for epilepsy soon became a window into the mysteries of consciousness, sparking decades of groundbreaking research that would reshape our understanding of the mind and, unintentionally, fuel the enduring myth of the left brain versus right brain person. Today, commissurotomies, those radical surgeries that cut the connections between the brain's hemispheres, are performed only in exceptional cases. The reason is not that they were ineffective, but that medicine has since developed better, safer alternatives. Since the 1960s, advances in antiepileptic drugs have transformed treatment. Medications are now able to control seizures for the vast majority of patients, reducing both their frequency and intensity without the risks of major brain surgery. On top of that, neurosurgeons have developed less invasive procedures, such as focal resections or targeted laser therapies, which remove or neutralize the specific brain tissue where seizures originate instead of severing communication between the hemispheres or yes. As a result, commissurotomies are now used only as a last resort, reserved for the rare cases of epilepsy so severe and resistant to medication that no other treatment works. Even then, the decision is carefully weighed, because cutting the brain's major communication pathways is irreversible and can have long-term effects, even if most patients adapt surprisingly well. What began as a bold experiment has now become a historical stepping stone. While commissurotomies are no longer routine, they played a crucial role in both epilepsy treatment and in shaping our scientific understanding of how the two hemispheres of the brain work together and, sometimes apart, around the same time that neurosurgeons were refining commissurotomy procedures. A neuropsychologist named Roger Sperry, together with his graduate student Michael Gazzaniga, began to study these so-called split-brain patients. For the first time in history, researchers had the chance to observe what happens when the left and right hemispheres of the brain are forced to work independently. No longer able to share information through the corpus callosum and other commissures, Sperry and Gazzaniga devised ingenious experiments to test what kinds of functions each hemisphere could handle on its own. By flashing words or images to just one visual field, therefore only reaching one hemisphere, they could essentially talk to each side of the brain separately. The results were astonishing. Patients sometimes said they hadn't seen anything because the information went to the right hemisphere, which lacks speech control. But their left hand might still draw or point to the correct answer, showing that the right hemisphere had processed the information silently. From these studies emerged the first clear evidence of lateralization. The left hemisphere seemed to dominate language and analytical tasks, while the right excelled in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and nonverbal processing. But what began as a scientific breakthrough quickly spilled into popular culture. Simplified and exaggerated by media and self-help books, Sperry and Gazzaniga's nuanced findings morphed into the catchy myth of the left brain as logical and the right brain as creative. This myth, though misleading, still lingers today because it offers an easy way to categorize human abilities. In truth, Sperry's work didn't prove the hemispheres to be rivals. Instead, it highlighted how each hemisphere contributes unique strengths, and how, in the intact brain, they are almost always working together. Once neurosurgeons began performing commissurotomies, something extraordinary happened. They created patients whose left and right hemispheres could no longer exchange information directly. The usual highway of communication, the corpus callosum and other commissures, had been cut, meaning that each hemisphere was now functioning largely on its own. This presented a fascinating scientific puzzle. In these patients, what the left hemisphere knew, the right hemisphere might not, and vice versa. For the first time, researchers could observe the hemispheres in isolation, something nature had never intended. Recognizing this unique opportunity, Roger Sperry, Michael Gazzaniga, and their colleagues began devising clever experiments to speak to just one hemisphere at a time. They took advantage of the brain's crossed wiring. Information from the left visual field is processed only by the right hemisphere. Information from the right visual field is processed only by the left hemisphere. By flashing words or images to one side of a patient's visual field for just a fraction of a second too fast for the eyes to shift, they could present information to a single hemisphere without the other one knowing. The results were astonishing. For example, if a word was shown to the right hemisphere via the left visual field, the patient often said they saw nothing because the left hemisphere controls speech and hadn't seen the word. But when asked to point or draw with the left hand controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient could select the correct object or sketch the image without hesitation. This ingenious method revealed something profound. The two hemispheres had different strengths and, when disconnected, acted almost like two separate minds within the same skull. These findings laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of lateralization and also sowed the seeds of the popular but oversimplified myth of the left brain logical versus right brain creative person. To isolate each half of the brain, Sperry and Gazzaniga relied on one of the brain's most basic rules. Each hemisphere processes information from the opposite visual field. The right hemisphere receives what appears in the left visual field, and the left hemisphere receives what appears in the right visual field. Using this principle, they devised clever experiments. Patients were asked to look straight ahead at a fixation point, while researchers quickly flashed an image or a word to just one side of their vision so fast that the eyes couldn't move to share it with both hemispheres. When an image was presented to the right hemisphere via the left visual field, something fascinating happened. If the patient was asked to say aloud what they saw, they usually replied nothing. That's because the right hemisphere, while perfectly capable of processing the image, does not control speech. The talking left hemisphere was in the dark, so verbally, the patient had nothing to report. But if the researchers asked the patient to point with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, the result was completely different. Without hesitation, the left hand could pick the correct object, draw the image, or respond accurately to the visual stimulus. This clever trick revealed a striking truth. The two hemispheres can know different things. The right hemisphere had seen the image and acted on it, even though the left hemisphere, the one responsible for speech, remained unaware. These early experiments demonstrated, in dramatic fashion, that the hemispheres are not redundant copies of each other. They have distinct roles and, when disconnected, behave almost like two separate minds within one brain. The challenge of testing split-brain patients. One of the biggest challenges in studying split-brain patients was that they were not passive subjects. They quickly learned to compensate for the loss of communication between their hemispheres. Normally, the two halves of the brain share information seamlessly, but once the commissures were cut, information presented to one hemisphere stayed there. It didn't automatically cross over. Patients, however, often adapted by moving their eyes, heads, or even bodies so that whatever they saw or heard would be processed by both hemispheres, restoring a sense of unity. For instance, if an object was shown only in the left visual field, so that only the right hemisphere could see it, a patient might instinctively shift their gaze to bring the object into the right visual field. This way, the left hemisphere, the one responsible for speech, would also register it. To an outside observer, the patient would seem completely normal, answering questions with ease, as though their brain were still fully connected. This natural compensation made it difficult for scientists to isolate the hemispheres and study their independent contributions. Sperry, Gazzaniga, and their colleagues had to design clever experimental setups using fixation points, controlled flashes of images, and strict instructions to ensure that only one hemisphere received the information. These precautions were necessary because, given the chance, patients' brains would find ways to cheat the experiment not consciously, but through instinctive movements designed to reunite their divided minds. To truly understand what each half of the brain could do on its own, researchers had to design ways to isolate the hemispheres during experiments. This wasn't easy under normal circumstances. Information naturally flows across the corpus callosum, blending both hemispheres' perspectives into a single, seamless experience. The solution came in the form of a clever experimental apparatus. Patients were asked to sit still and fix their gaze on a central point. Then, for just a fraction of a second, researchers would flash a word or an image either to the left visual field, which projects only to the right hemisphere, or to the right visual field, which projects only to the left hemisphere. The flash was so brief that the patient had no time to move their eyes, ensuring that only one hemisphere had access to the information. This setup gave researchers a rare opportunity. They could speak to one hemisphere at a time, without interference from the other. If the left hemisphere saw the stimulus, patients could typically name it out loud, since language is strongly left lateralized. But if the right hemisphere saw it, patients were often silent, insisting they saw nothing, yet their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, could still point to the correct object or draw a picture of what they'd seen. Through these ingenious experiments, Sperry and Gazzaniga revealed just how differently the hemispheres could operate when cut off from one another. The left brain dominated language and narrative, while the right brain processed spatial patterns and visual information. And yet, the real lesson wasn't division, it was how seamlessly the hemispheres usually work together. These studies showed not that we are left-brained or right-brained, but that the richness of human thought emerges from the constant dialogue between both halves. Every time you hold a conversation, you're relying heavily on your left hemisphere. It's the side that manages language, organizes words into sentences, and makes sense of what is being said to you. The left hemisphere is the brain's narrator, the one that puts experience into words. This reliance on the left for speech led to one of the most striking discoveries in split brain research. When Sperry and Gazzaniga flashed an image to a patient's right hemisphere via the left visual field, and then asked, "What did you see?" the patient often replied with complete honesty, "I don't know," or "nothing." The explanation is simple. The right hemisphere had indeed seen the image, but it didn't have direct access to language. The left hemisphere, which controls speech, was completely unaware of what the right hemisphere knew, so verbally, the patient had nothing to report. Yet the right hemisphere was far from silent in its own way. If the researchers asked the patient to point with the left hand or to draw what had been shown, the answer often appeared effortlessly. The left hand, guided by the right hemisphere, could pick out the correct object or sketch the correct image, even as the patient's words denied seeing anything at all. This disconnect created a fascinating paradox. One half of the brain could see and act, while the other half could speak but not know. It was one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations that the hemispheres, though interconnected, can hold separate streams of awareness when cut off from each other. The most astonishing moments in Sperry and Gazzaniga's experiments came when the right hemisphere was given information the left hemisphere couldn't see. At first, when asked what they had seen, patients replied honestly, "I don't know," or "nothing at all." The left hemisphere, the one that speaks, was in the dark. But then the researchers changed the test. Instead of asking patients to describe the image, they asked them to choose from a set of alternatives. Presented with several pictures laid out in front of them, the patient's left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, would reach out without hesitation and select the correct image. The shock came afterward. Patients were often surprised by their own behavior, insisting they were simply guessing. From the perspective of their verbal left hemisphere, they hadn't seen anything. And yet, the right hemisphere had silently processed the image and guided the left hand to the right answer. It was as though there were two minds inside one skull, one that could see but not speak, and another that could speak but not see. This gap between awareness and action gave neuroscientists a window into just how independently the hemispheres could function when cut off from one another. These experiments didn't just reveal the hidden talents of the right hemisphere, they also hinted at something deeper. The brain is not a single voice, but a chorus of processes, sometimes in harmony and sometimes out of sync. The storytelling left brain. When researchers asked patients why they performed a certain action like pointing to a picture their right hemisphere had secretly seen, the answer revealed one of the most surprising quirks of the human mind. The left hemisphere, which dominates speech and language, did not actually know why the action had been performed. But instead of admitting ignorance, it did something remarkable. It spontaneously invented a story to explain the behavior. This wasn't deliberate lying or conscious deception. The left brain simply filled in the missing pieces with a narrative that made sense to it. For example, if the right hemisphere had been shown the word snow and guided the left hand to select a picture of a shovel, the patient might explain, "No, I chose the shovel because I've been doing some gardening lately." To the patient, this explanation felt entirely true even though the real reason was hidden from their speaking half of the brain. Michael Gazzaniga called this function the interpreter. It's a built-in storytelling mechanism in the left hemisphere, one that continuously weaves together explanations for our behavior, even when it lacks complete information. These moments of confabulation are more than just curiosities. They reveal something profound about all of us. Our brains are not neutral recorders of reality. Instead, they are active storytellers, constantly piecing together fragments of perception, memory, and action into a coherent narrative we call me. The split brain experiments showed this in its most dramatic form. Two hemispheres, each with its own knowledge, one silently acting and the other confidently explaining, sometimes getting it completely wrong, but believing its story all the same. Michael Gazzaniga was the first to notice a peculiar pattern in his split-brain patients. After performing an action they couldn't consciously explain, they rarely admitted, "I don't know." Instead, their left hemisphere, the one responsible for speech, would confidently offer an explanation, even if it had no access to the real reason. From this observation, Gazzaniga proposed the idea of the interpreter, a storytelling mechanism in the brain. He argued that somewhere in the left hemisphere lies a function whose job is to weave experiences into a coherent narrative, whenever there's a gap in knowledge. This interpreter fills it with a plausible story. Importantly, it doesn't just invent explanations, it truly believes them, presenting them as reality to the person experiencing them. The interpreter, Gazzaniga suggested, works hand in hand with language. It takes the silent, often fragmented contributions from different brain systems and strings them together into the story of who we are and why we act. Without it, our behavior might feel like a collection of random impulses. With it, we gain the comforting illusion of consistency, even when the story isn't entirely accurate. This insight reshaped how neuroscientists think about the mind. It revealed that much of what we call consciousness may not be direct access to truth, but rather the narrative our brain constructs after the fact. In other words, we are not just perceivers of reality, we are storytellers of reality, constantly interpreting, editing, and sometimes rewriting the plot of our own lives. Another word for this type of post hoc explanation is confabulation. It describes the brain's tendency to justify an action without having the full information for why it was performed. Importantly, confabulation isn't lying, it's not a conscious attempt to deceive. Instead, It's the brain's interpreter at work, doing its best to maintain the illusion of coherence. In split-brain patients, this phenomenon was dramatic. When one hemisphere carried out an action and the speaking hemisphere had no access to the reason, the left brain would still provide a confident explanation. To the patient, this story felt genuine and true, even if it had no basis in the actual stimulus that triggered the action. But confabulation isn't limited to these rare patients. We all do it every day, from justifying impulsive purchases, to retroactively explaining a gut decision, to rationalizing our memories. The interpreter in our left hemisphere constantly fills in gaps with plausible stories. These narratives allow us to move through life feeling consistent and intentional even when our choices are driven by subconscious processes, emotions, or information outside our awareness. Confabulation highlights both the brilliance and the fragility of the human mind. We are meaning makers by nature, compelled to stitch together the fragments of experience into a story we can live with. And sometimes, those stories are more comforting than they are accurate. Michael Gazzaniga's research revealed just how far the left hemisphere's interpreter will go to preserve a sense of order. In split-brain patients, whenever the left hemisphere was asked to explain an action it hadn't initiated and for which it had no information, it still provided a story. For example, the right hemisphere might see an image and guide the left hand to respond appropriately. But when asked why they had chosen that response, the left hemisphere cut off from the information would invent a justification. These explanations weren't random guesses. They were detailed, logical, and delivered with full confidence. This process is called confabulation, the act of creating a narrative to explain behavior without access to the real cause. What makes it so striking is that the patient truly believed the invented story to be true. The interpreter wasn't aware it was fabricating, it was simply doing its job of weaving actions and experiences into a coherent whole. These findings suggested something profound about the human mind. Our sense of being a unified, rational self may be less about direct access to truth and more about the narratives our brain constructs after the fact. The left hemisphere, in its role as storyteller, ensures that we feel consistent even when different parts of our brain are acting independently or outside our awareness. In other words, we don't just live our lives, we explain our lives to ourselves, and sometimes those explanations are more convincing than they are accurate. What confabulation teaches us about the brain? These instances of confabulation in split-brain patients are more than just curiosities. They offer profound insights into how the human brain works. They show us that the mind is not a single, unified command center but a collection of specialized processes, often working in parallel. The interpreter in the left hemisphere simply ties these processes together into a seamless story, whether or not it has access to all the facts. By testing each hemisphere independently, neuroscientists like Sperry and Gazzaniga uncovered a wealth of information about lateralization, the division of labor between the two halves of the brain. Through these patients, we learned that language is primarily localized in the left hemisphere. Spatial and visual processing lean more heavily on the right hemisphere. Emotional interpretation, motor control, and problem solving often require interplay between both hemispheres, not just one. These studies reveal that the hemispheres are not in competition, as the left brain-right brain myth suggests. Instead, they are partners in cognition, each with specialized strengths that, when combined, give rise to the richness of human thought. Perhaps the most fascinating takeaway is this: our brains are constantly synthesizing partial information into a coherent whole, and we almost never notice the gaps. Split-brain patients simply made those gaps visible. In everyday life, our interpreters are doing the same work, shaping fragments of memory, emotion, and perception into the ongoing story we call ourself. Perhaps the most striking thing about split-brain patients is how ordinary they seem in everyday life. In casual conversation, or even during most tasks, you wouldn't notice anything unusual. They walk, talk, think, and interact like anyone else. Only in carefully controlled experiments when researchers deliberately present information to one hemisphere alone does the divide become apparent. That's because in the healthy brain, the two hemispheres are in constant communication. The corpus callosum and other hemispheres serve as superhighways, allowing signals to travel back and forth almost instantly. In fact, neuroscientists now know that the hemispheres spend far more time working together than operating in isolation. Complex thought, creativity, problem-solving, and emotional intelligence all depend on this seamless collaboration. The left hemisphere may excel at detail and language, while the right handles patterns and context, but neither can produce the richness of human thought alone. They are partners in cognition, each offering unique strengths that only reach their full potential when integrated with the other. This is why the old idea of being right-brained or left-brained is so misleading. The reality is much more fascinating. Our brilliance comes not from one hemisphere dominating the other, but from the synergy between them. For much of the 20th century, neuroscientists believed in a modular brain, the idea that each function was neatly tucked into its own dedicated region, like labeled compartments in a filing cabinet. Vision here, language there, memory in its own corner. This framework was simple, intuitive, and easy to teach, but neuroscience has moved beyond this view. Today, researchers recognize that the brain is not strictly modular, it's a networked organ, with circuits of regions that work together dynamically. Each brain region may have a primary role, but it rarely acts alone. Instead, regions are woven into intricate communication systems that flex and reconfigure depending on the task at hand. And many of these networks cross hemispheric lines. The left and right sides of the brain are not rival camps but collaborators. A creative task might engage not only the right hemisphere's visuospatial strengths but also the left hemisphere's linguistic and analytical power. Similarly, solving a logical problem may still rely on right hemisphere contributions to context, nuance, and pattern recognition. Modern imaging studies have shown that what we call intelligence, creativity, or even personality is best understood not as the work of one isolated region, but as the product of synchronized activity across networks. This interconnectedness explains why damage to one area can sometimes be compensated for by others, and why our brains are so adaptable. In short, the story of the brain is not about islands of function but about bridges of connection, a constantly shifting conversation between circuits that span both hemispheres. Few medical procedures highlight the brain's resilience and adaptability more dramatically than the hemispherectomy, the surgical removal of half of the brain. Though it sounds extreme, this operation is sometimes the only option when one hemisphere is so severely damaged or diseased that it threatens the health of the entire brain. Hemispherectomies are rare and are usually considered a last resort treatment. They are most often performed on children with catastrophic epilepsy or severe brain injury. In these cases, the damaged hemisphere may generate constant, uncontrollable seizures that medications cannot stop. Removing the dysfunctional half can not only save the patient's life but also give the healthy hemisphere a chance to thrive without constant disruption. What makes hemispherectomies so remarkable is how well many patients recover when the surgery is performed on young children. The remaining hemisphere often takes over many of the functions that would normally belong to the missing half. This is possible because the developing brain is extraordinarily plastic, able to rewire itself, reorganize circuits, and repurpose cortical real estate for vital tasks like language, motor control, or memory. While the recovery is not always perfect, many patients go on to live impressively normal lives, often walking, talking, and learning with far greater ability than one might imagine possible with only half a brain. This extraordinary adaptability demonstrates that lateralization, while real, is far more flexible than the right-brained left-brain myth suggests. Hemispherectomies remind us of a fundamental truth. The brain is not just a machine of fixed parts but a dynamic, living network, capable of remarkable transformation when pushed to its limits. Hemispherectomies are rare procedures, and when they are performed, they are almost always done on children rather than adults. The reason lies in the brain's remarkable ability to rewire itself during development. In children, the brain is still in a phase of high neuroplasticity. Circuits are forming, connections are flexible, and functions that would normally be confined to one hemisphere can be reassigned to the other if necessary. For example, language, which is strongly lateralized to the left hemisphere in most healthy adults, can often shift to the right hemisphere in a young child who loses their left side. The younger the patient, the greater the brain's ability to reorganize and take on new roles. By contrast, the adult brain is much more fixed in its structure. While it still retains some ability to adapt, the level of flexibility is far more limited. This means that an adult who undergoes a hemispherectomy would likely suffer far greater deficits than a child, with reduced potential for recovery of critical skills like speech, memory, and motor control. This is why hemispherectomies are usually considered only for pediatric patients with catastrophic epilepsy or severe brain damage, where the risks of doing nothing outweigh the potential downsides of losing half of the brain. In these cases, the surgery can be life-saving, and the outcomes, though never perfect, are often far more functional than anyone might expect. The fact that children can adapt so well to losing an entire hemisphere underscores a profound truth about the brain. It is not a rigid machine, but a self-repairing, dynamic system, especially during early life. One of the most extraordinary abilities of the brain is its plasticity, its capacity to reorganize, rewire, and repurpose itself when circumstances demand it. Hemispherectomy patients, especially children, are living proof of this power. When one hemisphere is removed, the other doesn't simply leave those functions behind. Instead, it often repurposes unused cortical real estate, taking over tasks that were once carried out by the missing half. Language, motor control, even aspects of memory and reasoning can be reassigned to new neural networks. What makes this even more astonishing is that this rewiring can occur at different stages before development. A child's brain can anticipate future needs, building new pathways to support skills that haven't yet fully formed after development has begun, even when a function like language has already taken root in one hemisphere. The opposite side can step in if necessary, re-establishing that capacity in a new location. This adaptability means that children who undergo hemispherectomies often go on to live remarkably functional, even normal lives. They may face challenges, slight motor deficits, vision field loss, or slower processing in some areas, but compared to the catastrophic seizures they once endured, the outcome is nothing short of miraculous. These cases remind us that the brain is not a rigid organ locked into a fixed design. It is a living, dynamic system, capable of reorganization and reinvention, proof that even when half the hardware is gone, the software of the mind can still find ways to run. Curious to learn more? The real story of split brain research goes far deeper than the left versus right brain myth. Check out Out of Contact, Out of Mind Turk, Heatherton McRae, Kellyanne Gazzaniga, and the Split Brain Wallman for fascinating insights into how our hemispheres really work. The myth of being right-brained or left-brained is catchy, but the truth is far more fascinating. Our hemispheres aren't rivals, they're partners. Creativity doesn't live in one half while logic hides in the other. Instead, both sides are in constant dialogue, weaving together the richness of human thought. So next time someone tells you they're a right brain creative or a left brain logical thinker, you'll know better. The real power comes from the integration of the whole brain. Thank you for watching Your Body's Clues. This episode gave you a new perspective. Share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more weekly insights into how your brain and body truly work. Remember, your brain is not divided, it's connected, and that's its greatest strength.